Rain poured relentlessly against the city streets, drowning out the faint whispers of those society had forgotten. Among them was a woman, wrapped in layers of worn-out blankets, her fingers trembling against the cold. She sat curled under the flickering glow of a broken street lamp, watching indifferent passers-by hurry along, their umbrellas shielding them from a world they refused to acknowledge. Then, a pair of polished shoes stopped in front of her. She didn't look up at first. People rarely stopped for someone like her. When they did, it was either to toss loose, change her way, or to mutter something cruel under their breath. But this time, the silence stretched. Finally, curiosity won. She lifted her eyes and saw a man in a tailored coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. His presence radiated something different, not pity, not kindness, but purpose. "I have a proposal," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. She scoffed. Another scam. Another game. But he knelt to her level, unfazed by the rain. "That wasn't normal. I'll pay you $1 million, he said, to have my child." The world around her disappeared. She blinked, unsure if she had misheard him. $1 million? For what? What? Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in disbelief. The man, clean-shaven, rich beyond comprehension, did not flinch. "You heard me." A laugh bubbled from her throat. She had been called many things, a burden, a mistake, invisible. But never $1 million opportunity. "This some kind of joke?" she asked. "No joke," he said, offering a card with nothing but a phone number on it. "Take time to think about it." She didn't take it. "Why me?" He hesitated. A flicker of something undecipherable crossed his eyes, but he masked it quickly. "I have my reasons." With that, he stood, nodded once, and walked away. For the first time in years, she had something other than survival to think about. She didn't sleep that night. The words haunted her. $1 million. It was more than she could fathom. More than she had seen in her lifetime. She could leave this life behind. She could find a home, eat real food, be a person again. But there was a problem. This wasn't normal. She had lived on the streets long enough to know nothing came without a price. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would find him. She needed to know why. And she had a feeling he wasn't telling her everything. The phone number stared back at her. For hours, she had turned the small, white card over and over in her fingers, half expecting it to disappear, as if it were some kind of hallucination. But it was real. The edges were crisp, the ink unsmudged, despite the dampness of her makeshift shelter. $1 million. It sounded like a dream, a cruel, impossible dream. What kind of man walked up to a homeless woman and made an offer like that? What kind of person paid that much money just to have a child? And, more importantly, why her? The thought gnawed at her. She wasn't special. She wasn't healthy, not by normal standards. She barely ate, barely slept. If he wanted someone to carry a child, there were clinics for that. There were women who wouldn't question it, wouldn't hesitate. So why pick a woman who had nothing? She had to know. Taking a deep breath, she found an old payphone near the gas station, a relic of a time when people still used coins to communicate. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the numbers. Each beep echoed in her ears. The line clicked. Silence. Then, a voice. "I was expecting your call." She swallowed. No hello. No hesitation. Just certainty. "You knew I'd call?" "Yes." His confidence sent a shiver through her spine. "Who are you?" she asked. There was a pause. Not long, but enough to make her uneasy. "I'm someone who can change your life," he said finally. "If you let me." She exhaled slowly. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and old cigarettes. "This isn't normal," she said. "I never said it was." Her grip tightened on the receiver. "Then what's the catch?" Another pause. I need an heir, he said simply. I have wealth, properties, a legacy to maintain. But no family. Something about his tone made her stomach twist. Why not adopt, she countered. I don't want an adopted child. I want my child. A strange feeling settled in her chest. There was something almost desperate in his voice, beneath the cool, collected words. And the mother, she asked. She's not in the picture? For the first time, she heard something unexpected. Regret. She was. Once. Silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. She didn't push. Not yet. And after the baby is born, she pressed instead. Then what? There was no hesitation this time. You will never have to worry about money again, he said. The child will be raised with everything they need. You will receive what I promised, and if you wish to leave, you are free to go. It sounded too easy. Too clean. She had lived long enough to know that deals like this never came without consequences. But what was her alternative? She had nothing. No family. No future. Just a series of nights sleeping on cold pavement and days hoping for scraps. $1 million. And all she had to do was bring a life into the world. Before she could second-guess herself, she whispered, okay. The next morning, a black car pulled up in front of an old diner where she had been waiting. She had expected luxury, something that screamed power and wealth. Instead, the car was simple. Blacked-out windows, unmarked. It wasn't flashy. It was deliberate. As she climbed inside, the driver, a man in a dark suit, silent as a ghost, barely acknowledged her. And when they drove through the city, past the streets she had called home, she realized this wasn't just a transaction. This was the beginning of something she might never escape. She hadn't expected the mansion. The car pulled up to a sprawling estate, a monstrous house of glass and stone tucked away behind iron gates. It looked like something out of a dream or a trap. She hesitated before stepping out. The driver didn't rush her. Didn't say a word. He simply waited, his gloved hands resting on the wheel, as if he had done this before. A butler greeted her at the entrance, his expression unreadable. No warmth, no curiosity. Just another employee following orders. This way, he said. She followed him through hallways so pristine she was afraid to touch anything. The air smelled expensive, fresh linen, polished wood, and something faintly floral. It was the scent of a world she didn't belong to. And yet, here she was. At the end of the hall stood him. The businessman. He had changed from his tailored coat into a crisp black suit, but his demeanor remained the same, controlled, measured. I see you've arrived safely, he said. She nodded, feeling wildly out of place. Her clothes were still damp from last night's rain, her shoes stained with city grime. She shouldn't be here. But she was. She swallowed hard. So what happens now? He gestured toward a woman standing nearby. A doctor. Medical exams. Full checkups. We'll ensure everything is in order before moving forward. Moving forward. The word sent a shiver down her spine. The first few weeks were strange. She was fed. Clothed. Given her own room, bigger than any space she had ever called home. Everything was monitored. Her meals, her sleep, even her emotions. The mansion had everything, doctors, nutritionists, people she never even saw, working in silence. She wasn't just carrying a baby. She was an investment. And the businessman? He never pressured her. Never asked anything beyond routine updates. But he watched. Always calm, always in control. But his eyes, they told a different story. He was waiting for something. Then the pregnancy symptoms hit. Morning sickness. Fatigue. Painful cravings for food she had never even liked. She had expected the discomfort. What she hadn't expected were the nightmares. They started around the 8th week. Dark corridors. Distant crying. A presence, something just out of sight, watching. She would wake up breathless, her skin damp with sweat. Every time she mentioned them to the doctor, they reassured her. Hormones, they said. Completely normal. But it didn't feel normal. It felt like something inside her was changing. And it wasn't just the baby. The businessman began spending more time at the mansion. He would sit in the library, reading documents she wasn't allowed to see. One night, unable to sleep, she passed by his study and heard him on the phone. "She's progressing as expected," he said, his voice low. "But we need to be prepared." Prepared for what? She pressed closer, but the floor creaked under her feet. Instantly, the conversation stopped. The door swung open. He stared at her, unreadable. "You should be resting." Her mouth went dry. "I couldn't sleep." A pause. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "Come in." She hesitated but stepped inside. The study was nothing like the rest of the house. Dim lighting. Heavy curtains. A large, antique desk covered in papers. Too many papers. And on one of them, her name. Her stomach twisted. She pointed at the document. "What is this?" Instead of answering, he sighed and closed the folder. "You have nothing to worry about." Her pulse pounded. Lies. She should have run then. She should have walked out, demanded answers. But she was carrying his child. And she had nowhere else to go. For now, she would wait. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just about a baby. Something was coming. And she was in the middle of it. She had never felt like this before. It wasn't just the pregnancy symptoms, the morning sickness, the fatigue, the cravings. It was something deeper. Something she couldn't explain. She would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, her hand on her stomach as if something inside her was trying to tell her something. And then there were the strangers. At first, she thought they were just employees, doctors, assistants, people moving through the mansion like shadows. But she soon noticed that they never spoke. They never acknowledged her. And worst of all? They were always watching. One evening, she stood by the window, watching the world outside. The estate was massive, surrounded by dense trees, cutting her off from the city she once knew. She hadn't left the property since she arrived. She wasn't allowed to. She had never asked outright, but something about the way the businessman and his staff controlled everything told her the answer. She was a guest. But also a prisoner. The changes started in the 3rd month. Subtle at first. She felt stronger, too strong for someone barely eating and sleeping. Her hair seemed thicker. Her skin glowed in a way that wasn't just pregnancy. And then there was the heartbeat. Not hers. Not the baby's. Something else. Something she felt pulsing beneath her ribcage late at night. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But one evening, as she lay in bed, she placed her hands on her belly and felt it move. Not a kick. Not a flutter. Something, shifting. Like it was reacting to her touch. She gasped and pulled her hands away. She gasped and pulled her hands away. No. That wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. The businessman's behavior changed too. He was more present than ever, lingering in the hallways, checking in on her without a word. He wasn't affectionate, never had been. But there was a strange, almost obsessive focus in his gaze now. He was waiting. For what? By the 4th month, the dreams turned into something else. She was no longer just seeing dark corridors or distant figures. She was hearing voices. Soft, familiar whispers. And the worst part? They were calling her by name. She had no family. No one who knew her well enough to call out to her like that. And yet, every night, the same thing. The whispers grew clearer. It's almost time. You need to be ready. He knows. She would wake up, covered in sweat, the words ringing in her ears. She tried telling the doctor. But they just smiled, their expression too blank. This is normal. No. No, it wasn't. One night, unable to take it anymore, she left her room and followed the whispers. They led her down the hall, past the library, to a locked door. A door she had never seen open. She pressed her ear against it. Silence. But she knew. Something was behind it. She tried the handle. Locked. Of course, it was locked. She took a step back, heart hammering. She needed answers. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted them. The next morning, she made a decision. She needed to test something. Standing in front of the mirror, she placed a hand on her stomach again. And thought. Just a thought. A single, quiet wish. Move. The baby responded. She felt it, not just the kick, not just movement. It listened. Her breath caught. What was inside her? At breakfast, she faced the businessman directly. I need answers, she said, her voice steady. He looked at her for a long moment before sighing. Then, for the first time, he said something that terrified her more than anything else. You already know. Her breath hitched. You already know. The words settled in the air, thick and unshakable. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles white. No, she said slowly. I don't. The businessman folded his hands in front of him. He was calm, too calm. You do, he insisted, tilting his head slightly. You felt it. A cold wave crashed over her. Felt it. The movement that wasn't normal. The way the baby responded to her thoughts. The heartbeat that wasn't just hers. No. No, it couldn't be, she shook her head violently. I don't know what you're talking about. His eyes flickered with something. Pity? No. Recognition. You're afraid. She was. But she wouldn't admit it. She had learned long ago that fear was a weakness. And weakness was a death sentence. I want answers, she said through gritted teeth. The businessman leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. Then tell me, he said, watching her carefully. When was the last time you felt pain? She blinked. What? Her mind raced, searching for something, anything. The nausea, the discomfort, yes, she had experienced those. But pain? Real pain? Her fingers trembled as she pressed a hand against her stomach. There had been nights she couldn't sleep. Moments where she felt lightheaded or restless. But not pain. Not once. And she realized she should have. By 4 months, pregnancies were supposed to bring aches, swollen feet, back pain, discomfort. She had nothing. She had gained weight, but she still moved easily. Still breathed effortlessly. Even the sickness had been mild, controlled. And in that moment, she understood. Something wasn't normal. Her head snapped up. What did you do to me? The businessman exhaled, slowly, rubbing his fingers together. You're not sick, he said. Her stomach churned. That's not an answer. His gaze flickered to her stomach. She followed his eyes, suddenly hyper-aware of what was inside her. You're changing, he said, matter of fact. Her pulse thundered. No. She was just pregnant. That was all. A deal, a transaction. Money in exchange for carrying a child. That was it. She wasn't changing. She wasn't, her breath came in sharp gasps. This wasn't happening. Not to her. She shot up from her chair, the wooden leg scraping against the marble floor. I want out. The businessman didn't react. She moved toward the door. His voice followed her. Where will you go? She didn't stop. Didn't answer. She just needed to get out. But as she reached the door, a sharp pressure bloomed in her stomach. Not pain. Something else. Something, shifting. Her body froze against her will. And in the silence, she heard it. A voice. Not her own. Not the businessman's. Inside her. Speaking. Don't leave. Her fingers dug into the doorframe. No. No, no, no. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't hearing things. But the presence inside her was unmistakable. It wasn't just a baby. It was something else. Something that could communicate. Her breath hitched, panic rising in her chest. She turned slowly, her entire body trembling. What, she whispered, did you put inside me? The businessman stood, adjusting his cufflinks. His next words shattered her. I didn't put anything inside you, he said. You were chosen. Her world collapsed. Chosen? She had spent her entire life being nothing. Discarded. Invisible. Forgotten. No one chose her. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself against the doorframe. She forced herself to breathe. Think. Chosen, for what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The businessman walked toward her. Not menacing. Not aggressive. But his presence was heavy. You don't remember, do you? He asked. She frowned. Remember what? His gaze was steady. How you ended up on the streets. Her blood ran cold. She clenched her fists. I know how I ended up there. No family. No home. Just bad luck, bad choices. That was the truth. Wasn't it? But something in his expression told her otherwise. You were meant to be here, he said. This isn't a coincidence. She shook her head, taking a step back. No. I found you. You offered me a deal. I found you first. The words cut through her defenses. What are you saying? She whispered. He didn't blink. You weren't just some random woman, he said. You were put on this path for a reason. She felt sick. No. That wasn't true. That couldn't be true. But then why? Why did the baby inside her feel so connected to her? Why did she feel like her body wasn't just carrying a life, but merging with it? Her hands trembled. What am I? She whispered. The businessman exhaled softly. Then he said the words that broke everything she thought she knew. You're not just having a baby, he said. You're becoming something else. The room spun around her. Her fingers clutched the doorframe, but it felt unreal, as if the ground beneath her had lost its substance. You're not just having a baby. You're becoming something else. The businessman's words pulsed in her skull, an unbearable drumbeat of something ancient and inevitable. She shook her head violently. No, she whispered. No, that's not, but she stopped. Because the truth was already inside her. She could feel it, deeper than bones, deeper than blood. This wasn't just a child growing inside her. It was her. Or rather, she was becoming it. A tremor ran through her body. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She had to leave. Now. She waited until midnight. The mansion was too quiet. Not just silent in the way large houses were, but unnaturally still. Like it was listening. She crept from her room, heart hammering. She had mapped out the halls in her mind, memorized the routes, counted every exit. The front door was too obvious. The guards, silent men in black suits who never spoke, would be stationed there. She needed another way. She slipped through the corridors, avoiding the light. Something inside her whispered, guiding her. Left. Not that way. Wait. Now move. Was it instinct? Or was it something else? She shuddered, swallowing her fear. The kitchen. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the cold tile numbing her bare feet. There, a back exit, leading toward the servants' quarters. Freedom was steps away. She bolted. Her fingers brushed the handle, and then she heard him. I was hoping you wouldn't try this. Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned. The businessman stood in the doorway. Calm. Unshaken. Like he had expected this. Her heart pounded. No. No, no, no. She wouldn't let him trap her here. She tightened her grip on the door handle. Let me go. A flicker of something crossed his face. Sadness. I can't. Her breath hitched. His voice was steady, but there was something else in it, regret. As if he wasn't in control of this either. She forced herself to stay calm. You said I was free to leave after the baby was born. He inclined his head. Yes. After. Her stomach churned. She could feel it again. The presence inside her. Awake. Listening. Her body tensed. She had to get out. Before it was too late. She made a split-second decision. Run. She yanked the door open, but the moment she stepped outside, her body collapsed. Pain, not normal pain. Not human pain. Like every cell in her body was locking her in place. She gasped, falling to her knees, gripping the cold ground as her vision blurred. What was happening? She tried to move, but it was like her own body was resisting her. Like it wouldn't let her leave. Terror struck her deeper than ever before. She lifted her eyes to the businessman. He wasn't chasing her. He wasn't angry. He was just watching. Waiting. Because he had known. She couldn't leave. Not because of the mansion. Not because of him. Because of the baby. It was keeping her here. When she woke, she was back in her room. The lights were dimmed, the air thick with something she couldn't name. She turned her head slowly, and nearly screamed. The businessman sat beside her bed, his hands clasped together. Not in menace. Not in control. But in quiet surrender. You understand now, don't you? He murmured. Tears burned her eyes. She clenched the sheets, her body trembling. I can't leave, she whispered. He shook his head. No, a sob threatened to escape her throat. What is happening to me? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. And for the first time, he didn't sound like the calculated businessman who had approached her that night in the rain. He sounded like a man who had lost something. You were chosen, he said again. The words made her want to scream. Chosen for what? She demanded. He hesitated. And then, softly. To become the mother of something greater. Her breath caught. He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. Not just a mother. His eyes flickered, dark with something ancient, knowing. You're becoming a vessel. A cold wave of pure horror crashed over her. She clutched her stomach, feeling the undeniable pulse of life inside her. Not just a baby. Something else. Something that wanted her. She shook her head, choking on panic. No. No, I didn't agree to this, the businessman closed his eyes. It was never about what you agreed to. A tremor ran through her. She thought she had made a choice. But in reality, the choice had already been made for her. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't want this. A long silence. Then, finally, neither did I. Her breath hitched. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You think this is my plan? He murmured. I'm just another piece in this. Just like you. A lump rose in her throat. A lump rose in her throat. Then tell me, she whispered, voice cracking. What happens to me when this baby is born? The businessman's eyes darkened. And for the first time since she met him, he looked afraid. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know one thing. He swallowed hard. When that baby comes, you won't be the same. The pain started at exactly midnight. Not a slow build. Not a dull ache. A sudden, sharp pulling from the core of her body, like something inside her was waking up. She gasped, gripping the bed sheets, her nails digging deep into the fabric. She had spent the last few weeks dreading this moment. And now, it was here. Her breath came in ragged bursts as the pressure built inside her. Not just labor. Transformation. She felt it in her bones, in her skin, something unraveling, reshaping. The businessman stood at the foot of the bed, silent, watching. His face was unreadable. Because he didn't know what would happen either. No one did. The mansion came alive with movement. Doctors. Assistants. People in pristine white coats moving like ghosts through the dimly lit hallways. She barely registered their presence. All she could feel was the weight of something ancient pressing against her. Inside her. Her vision blurred. Her ears rang. Then, whispers. Not from the people around her. From inside. Soft. Familiar. Calling her name. It's time. She clutched her stomach, feeling the rippling energy beneath her skin. She knew, somehow, she knew, this wasn't going to be a normal birth. This was going to be a rebirth. Of her. Of the thing inside her. And maybe. Of the world itself. The pain reached an unbearable peak. Her back arched. Her vision fractured. Everything slowed, the world folding inward. And then, everything stopped. Time. Motion. Sound. The room around her vanished. No doctors. No mansion. No businessman. Just her. And it. Floating in a void, suspended between two existences. Her body tingled, as if she were slipping through the seams of reality itself. She looked down. Her stomach was no longer round. It was glowing. The skin stretched thin, pulsing with light. The baby was emerging, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't blood. It wasn't screaming. It was energy. Pure, undiluted life force. A shape, small, human-like, but not entirely. It hovered between her and the nothingness, its tiny form radiating a golden glow. Her breath caught. It was looking at her. Not like a newborn. Not with confusion. With understanding. It knew her. She knew it. And then, it spoke. Not with words. Not with sound. But directly into her mind. You were never meant to be ordinary. Her pulse thundered. She reached out, trembling. The moment her fingers touched the child's form, the world snapped back into place. She gasped as she was thrust back into her body. The mansion. The doctors. The businessman. The sound of hurried voices. The beeping of machines. The bright, sterile lights burning into her eyes. But something was different. Very different. The room was silent. The doctors stood frozen, their faces drained of color. And the businessman. He was pale. Shaken. She followed their gaze. Looked down. And there it was. Her baby. But not a baby. Not in the way they had expected. It was perfect. Too perfect. Smooth, flawless skin that shimmered faintly under the lights. Eyes that weren't human, too large, too knowing. Tiny fingers curled and uncurled, as if testing the very air around it. And then, it lifted its head. Newborns weren't supposed to do that. Newborns weren't supposed to glow. The businessman inhaled sharply. Impossible, he whispered. the child turned to him. Acknowledged him. And in that moment, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. The businessman, the man who had orchestrated this entire thing, was afraid. Her heart pounded. Slowly, carefully, she reached out. Her child's tiny hand wrapped around her finger. Warmth spread through her, an overwhelming rush of something powerful. And then she heard its voice again. Inside her mind. I chose you. Tears welled in her eyes. This wasn't just a baby. It wasn't just a deal. It was a being beyond human understanding. And she was its mother. Her grip tightened protectively. Because in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. The businessman wasn't afraid of the baby. He was afraid of what would happen next. The silence in the room was absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire world had been caught in an invisible force, held still by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. The baby, her child, was no ordinary infant. It lay in her arms, impossibly small, yet radiating something beyond human understanding. Its skin glowed faintly, a shimmer that wasn't just light but something deeper. Something alive. And its eyes, those eyes, held a wisdom that shouldn't belong to a newborn. It wasn't confused, wasn't fragile like human infants. It was aware. She felt a strange sense of connection, something primal and overwhelming. She had spent months fearing this moment, questioning what she had agreed to, dreading what she had become. But now, holding the child in her arms, something shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but understanding took its place. The moment their skin touched, a surge of warmth flowed through her, a presence settling deep inside her soul. It was looking at her, not with need, not with helplessness, but with recognition. As if it had been waiting for her all along. Then, the baby moved. Not a fragile stretch or an awkward newborn twitch. It lifted its hand deliberately, as if testing the air. Its tiny fingers curled and uncurled, flexing like it was adjusting to existence itself. A low, hushed murmur spread through the room. The doctors, the ones who had spent months monitoring her, the ones who had thought they had control over this, stepped back. Their faces were pale, drained of color, their scientific minds crumbling under the weight of what they were witnessing. The businessman didn't move. He stood frozen, staring, his mask of control finally cracking. He had orchestrated this entire thing. He had paid her, locked her in this mansion, watched over her like a prized experiment. And yet, now that the moment had arrived, he was terrified. His hands curled into fists at his sides. She saw it. The way his breath had gone shallow, the way his eyes darted between her and the child as if trying to calculate something he had no formula for. He had been waiting for this day. But he had never expected this. And then, the baby turned its head toward him. A single motion, small and unassuming, but every person in the room reacted as if the air had been knocked from their lungs. Because infants didn't do that. Newborns didn't acknowledge things this early. Yet, this one did. The businessman flinched. Just for a second. But she saw it. The baby blinked once, slowly. And then, he spoke. Not with words. Not with sound. Inside her head. And she knew, everyone else in the room heard it too. You are afraid. A collective gasp rippled through the space. A doctor stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of surgical instruments. The metal clattered against the floor, a sharp, jarring sound that seemed to snap the room out of its trance. Someone cursed under their breath. A nurse's hands were shaking. Her grip on the baby tightened instinctively. They were afraid of him. She turned to the businessman, watching the way his jaw tightened, the way his entire body was rigid. He didn't answer. Didn't deny it. The baby's voice echoed again, soft yet impossibly powerful. You wanted me. Now I am here. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, undeniable truth. The businessman exhaled slowly, regaining some of his composure. He took a step forward, but she reacted before she even realized what she was doing. Her body moved instinctively, shifting away, shielding the baby. She didn't trust him. Not anymore. Maybe she never had. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something almost close to hurt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I kept my promise, he said carefully, as if choosing his words one by one. You'll never have to worry about money again. You're free to go. She stared at him. Just like that? Months of secrecy, of control, of feeling like a prisoner, and now, she was free? No. It wasn't that simple. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It never had been. She had thought she was carrying his child. That this was some twisted attempt to create an heir. But now, looking at the baby in her arms, feeling the pulse of something not entirely human beating alongside her own. She knew the truth. This child didn't belong to him. Didn't belong to anyone. She had been a vessel, yes. But not for him. For something far greater. Something older than human history. And he knew it too. That's why he was afraid. She met his gaze, searching for an answer, but he had none to give. All he could do was wait. Wait for what would happen next. Because they both knew, this was only the beginning.